So anyways, so you can think about these hypothalamic systems being in place, more or less ready to go at birth, and then having to organize themselves into a sophisticated and integrated single ego that acts across time and in the social environment. And you know, when Piaget originally started talking about child development, he regarded the child as something that was born into the world with just a set of very primordial reflexes, mostly sucking reflexes and some primary motor reflexes. He was very much a constructionist, but I would say, you know, had he been alive now, his constructionism would have been modified by the relevant neurophysiological data showing that there's a lot more built into us right from the beginning than Piaget expected. You still might need experience to catalyze the development, but obviously children are born with the ability to hear and to see and to sense with touch, and they're hungry and tired and angry, and like they have the whole range of emotions at hand, and they also come into the world with their motivation already in place. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to form a relationship with them, and that's modified by the development of the higher cortical systems through play and through social negotiation. But the biology is there to begin with, and so that's a good way to think about it with regards to understanding how the fundamental biological systems operate and how they manifest themselves in personality and in story, because you do that all the time. You tell a story about how you got angry, and it's basically a story about being dominated by a particular kind of sub-personality, which would be hypothalamic, and exactly how you manifested that and what the consequences were. And you know, I was very mad at this person, but I knew I couldn't get too upset because, and that's a good story that indicates both the highly motivated nature of the original response tendency and then your immediate proclivity to have to figure out how to negotiate that expression within a social space so that the medium to long-term consequences are positive rather than negative. And people are very interested in such bits of information, such units of information, because we need to know how to conduct ourselves in complex environments. And so if someone's willing to share their experience and they can narrate it in an interesting story, we're absolutely more than happy to listen, because in some sense we're assembling our identities out of those stories. And then you can think that there are patterns across stories, which is really a useful thing to understand, because that gives you real insight into what constitutes an archetype, because an archetype is what's common across sets of stories. That might be one way of looking at it. So an archetype is like a meta story. And so part of what we're going to turn to now in this discussion is a description of certain meta stories. And there's a particular meta story that I'm most interested in, and that's the story about how stories transform themselves. And so that I think is the most fundamental story that characterizes human beings. There's the story, I was here, I implemented some behaviors and I went there was better than here. That's the fundamental unit. But the thing about structures like that is that they may work in one situation and not in another, or at one time and not in another, and thus they have to be modified. And it was partly for this reason that Piaget, as his career as a developmental psychologist progressed, started to understand that it was more important not so much to understand the given structure of a knowledge structure, but to understand the manner in which knowledge structures transformed. And that was partly illustrated in his description of stage theory, because stages were really movement from one set of axiomatic presuppositions that with which the child was structuring the world into a state where that system failed because it wasn't sufficiently comprehensive, and then into the development of a new stage that could do everything the previous stage could, plus account for all the things that the previous stage couldn't. So that's also why Piaget believed that knowledge actually accumulated, because each time there was a transformation, the new structure had a wider range of application than the previous structure, even though it kept all the advantages of the previous structure. And so that's a good way of conceptualizing progress, because it's not that easy. You know, if you're a relativist, fundamentally you don't believe in difference between knowledge structures, say, and you certainly don't believe in the idea of progress. But if you think about a more sophisticated structure as being able to do more things properly, then you can certainly map out progress with no problem. And you know that because you see people operating the world who are less competent, generally speaking, and more competent, generally speaking. And there doesn't seem to be much debate about that. You can recognize people like that very, very easily. So